Welcome to our first episode of our AP World History podcast. With me is Dexter and David, and today we're going to be comparing states based on how differently they built, ran, and maintained their power. The strongest of all the states was India and China, and they both ran their lands quite differently. For starters, China's hierarchy consisted of political officials creating an elite bureaucracy. India used a thing called caste systems, and at the top were the Brahmins, who held the highest rank and were the priests. The caste system was used throughout all levels of how it was run, like its basis of status, in which they used this system to sort of rank people. Sudra were peasants or servants. Vaishya were merchants. I might butcher this, was Kshatriya were warriors, and the Brahmin were, of course, the priests. So it kind of just ranked each other based on a rigid scale. As for China, status was obtained by performance in exams, ownership of the land, and your loyalty to the state. China as a whole changed dynasties quite a bit, going from the Song dynasty to the Yuan dynasty and then the Ming dynasty. The Song dynasty was defined by Neo-Confucianism. Then the Mongols came around and the religions became more diverse, most notably Buddhism, Islam, and for a short stint Christianity. The Ming dynasty rolled around and brought back Neo-Confucianism, as they viewed it as a glue that would fix the damage that was done by the Mongol rule. And as for India, it saw Hinduism during the golden age of the Bhakti movement, and with the Delhi Sultanate came Islam. Although the rulers were Muslim, people just didn't convert. However, Sufism became a bridge kind of thing between Hindus and Muslims because of its focus on spiritual experience over strict law. Other notable states would be somewhere like the Islamic world. This is where the caliphates were located, where the Abbasid Caliphate governed some territory from Spain to the borders of India. Baghdad, the House of Wisdom, became the world center for science, math, and philosophy. Muslim merchants were also the connective tissue of the Silk Roads and the Indian Ocean trade, not only just spreading goods, but also the Arabic language and their faith. In the Americas, you had the Maya, who were kind of the masters of math, and had the most sophisticated writing system in the Americas. As for the Andes, civilizations like the Mochi, and later on the Inca adapted to extreme mountain environments with terrace farming and complex irrigations. Chalkia, which is actually modern-day St. Louis, if you didn't know that, was a massive hub of trade and pyramid building. Africa was honestly based off three things: gold, salt, and faith. In West Africa, you had the Ghana, the land of gold. The kingdom of Ghana rose to power after taxing the trade of gold for salt from the Sahara. In East Africa, cities like Kilwa and Mombasa became wealthy hubs where African, Arab, and Indian cultures blended, creating the language of Swahili. In Ethiopia, they were one of the few regions to adopt Christianity outside of the Roman Empire, making it unique from the rest of Eastern Africa. And then you had Europe and the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines were the eastern half of the Roman Empire and it survived in Constantinople. It acted as a shield for Europe and a preserver of Roman law and Greek culture. The Kievan Rus in the 10th century was the emerging state of Rus, which is modern-day Ukraine or Russia, adopted Eastern Orthodox Christianity from the Byzantines, a move that permanently linked Slavic culture to the Byzantine world. And Western Europe, which after following the fall of Rome, this region was highly decentralized, but began to stabilize and reconnect with the rest of the world through the Crusades shortly before 1200 CE.
All right, so in Asia, there were many differences and similarities, right? In East Asia, China and its neighbors, China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, right, were all in a pretty relative proximity. And Japan was very, I wouldn't like to say separated, but I would say pretty separated. Korea and Vietnam definitely took a lot of stuff over. And note, this was before Mongol takeover, so Song Dynasty, 960 to 1279 AD. And this was kind of the golden age, right? Some of the best types of art were made during this time. Their porcelain, well, I'm not too sure if they actually got their porcelain yet, but their ceramics were definitely very valued, to say the least, right? And in each area, their economic revolutions were very different. Some came in different sections, and some really just came in like one field, and there's definitely a lot of similarities, especially when you look at like the underlying ideologies like Confucianism, right? Which Korea made multiple versions. If I'm not too mistaken, Vietnam did as well. And I believe Japan also does have some underlying mix with that, right? And another very, I would say, kind of large thing is that all these groups really treated people kind of like different, right? So, for example, with women, the Song Dynasty did foot binding, which was pretty much wrapping and honestly sort of kind of mutilating women's feet to... I'm not exactly sure why. It was kind of viewed as a status for a lot, it seems. And it was kind of associated with beauty. But Korea doesn't really seem to like them. Admittedly, they were definitely prohibited much more, and they were all like more oppressive features of Chinese Confucianism culture. Were definitely put to Korean women, and honestly the Japanese really they weren't doing foot binding, but they weren't oppressing their women, and the Japanese also did have very different education. They had a code of ethics. They had so many different types of people within their actual army, and there's a very it's a very distinct culture for them because of their isolation. It did make them less. It did make them mix less with other states, and Vietnam expanded, and they grew champa rice, which was really the only reason why any state kind of expanded. And they adopted Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, new techniques, exam, artistic, literary styles, really everything. And they did do a tribute system as a vassal state for China. And they were very important. Now, Islam was also around this time. What Muslim called the Dar al-Islam, or the House of Islam, was firmly established, and it was pretty important. It was from Afro-Eurasia to Spain and Morocco, in the west to North India in the east, and this was really a large kind of stepping stone for the Islamic world, because this was where it really began. Now, in 1200, where this is around the end of where, I think this is 79 years before the Song Dynasty pretty much fall. The Abbasid Caliphate, a Arab dynasty that ruled most of the Islamic world, if it wasn't already in common practice, kind of became a shadow. They made a capital in Baghdad, which was pretty important, and they definitely presided over a lot of flourishing civilizations of Islam, and their political grip was kind of slipping. In the mid-9th century, governors and military asserted autonomy, and their allegiance, it didn't really seem the same. The Middle East really changed around 1000 AD, when Turkic-speaking pastoralists found the steppes of Central Asia and the fragmenting political landscape of the Abbasid. At first, things were definitely weird. They took political and military power themselves for the most part. When the caliphate wouldn't really work with them. Now, the Seljuk Turkic Empire of the 11th and 12th centuries, for instance, began to claim the title of Sultan, which is the Muslim title of ruler, rather than the Turkic version of that word. And this is really where the Turks kind of expand into this new role of a major sustainer of Islam and carrier faith. And by 1200, the Islamic heartland really begins to spread fully. The Ottoman Empire really does start to begin, and a creation of many Turkic warrior groups brought a lot of political unity to the Islamic Middle East and North Africa. And by the 15th century, the Ottomans carved out a state, pretty much, and they pushed into the Balkans. They really got into a lot of very important areas for religion, for converting, for really spreading faith. And there's the whole Constantinople thing, where the Ottoman definitely expanded into Eastern Europe, and it had huge. It had so much significance in the 15th century and mostly beyond, until its inevitable, ending, which really wasn't that long ago in a timeline. It had massive territory, long duration. It was very multicultural, multi-ethnic. And Ming Dynasty China, which was in the 15th century, and the Incas matched it in terms of wealth, power, and splendor. It had a lot of faith, and they added caliph to a lot of their other titles. They claimed sultan, and they kind of claimed the legacy of the earlier Abbasid Empire, and this was kind of like really when the Islamic world, it does skip a little bit in this, but that's kind of from when they very first begin to where they really change, and they were very, very important. They're valuable to trade. They had a lot to do with the trade routes. And India and Spain kind of had a lot of Islamic interactions, despite very different culture, different religions. And it was a very important time. And emerging civilizations in Africa, like the Swahili, which was a massive trade group, and all these other were very, very valuable. Now, in Africa, again, with the Swahili, it was all along the East Africa coast. It was very important. It spread a lot of languages, faiths, trade. Very, very important place, And West African civilization, especially in like Mali and I believe Ghana as well. You found people like Mansa Musa and these other very large groups that are very valuable in early African development, where they have so much access to gold, to just so much resources, where eventually when they do leave and go on their pilgrimage of sorts, they find they give out so much gold and so much rare resource that economies crash, and around this time, the trans-Saharan slave trade did begin to development, and this kind of goes in from where Christianity definitely does start to make a play, while a lot of Islam spreads. Places like Ethiopia go into Christianity, and they kind of stay there, which is mostly why it's kind of avoided colonization. Most of its life is that it is Christian. There's no converting that needs to happen. And much like Islam, Christianity did develop quite a bit. The Byzantine Empire, which existed for a while, it was sophisticated, it was powerful. It went into a very deep decline around 1200, and it just kind of shot into a hole, and it just disappeared, And its religious, political, cultural tradition is massive. They introduced Rus, a emerging civilization in Eastern Europe, and it was a different version of Orthodox Christian. I think that's the only way to put it. It was Eastern Orthodox. It definitely had differences. For some people, it's a continuation of the Roman Empire. For some, they do view it different, because it does have elements from a lot of them. They did have quite a impact in the Mediterranean and the Balkans, and a lot of these areas where they were definitely active. Their society and economy and culture in Europe itself were all very different, with a lot of the same underlining things, such as religion. That was a very, very big part. European Renaissance changed honestly a lot. I believe around it was definitely earlier on. Spain did turn into a more Christian Catholic type of state during the Reconquistadors, which is European Renaissance, which was roughly about like 350 to 1500 AD. It definitely changed quite a bit. Different literature. They returned to the source, as some put it. Very, very new artists emerged. Very valuable. And in the Mesoamerica, you had Aztecs and Incas, they both worked off tribute. Incas had people work for them as tribute. Aztecs had stuff like blood sacrifices, like resource tribute. They both had very powerful armies, and the Aztecs were not liked. The Aztecs and the Incas were definitely very, very different. They aren't really similar on actually quite a few ends, despite being pretty not quite local, but definitely same continent. But they did end up quite different. The Aztecs, again, blood sacrifices, resource tributes. They were very, very warlike, and they solved their problems kind of by just having a conflict. They had a very fight it out type culture, and that's kind of why they were taken over so easily when that time eventually came, was because they went through a civil war, and then you get a bunch of new people from Europe show up, and now your army's too weak to fight it off. Very, very different from the Inca. The Incas venerated, a lot of stuff. They worshipped a lot. And they definitely had a very interesting thing. They venerated the sun. The men venerated the sun while women worshipped the moon. With, Aztec temples, both male and female priests presided over rituals dedicated to deities of both genders, particularly among the Incas. So parallel hierarchies of male and female political officials governed the empires, but in Aztec society, women officials exercised local authority under a title that meant female person in charge of people. Social roles were pretty identified for both genders, but the concerns of women were not regarded as inferior to the activities of men, which would be childbirth, cooking, weaving, cleaning, which was admittedly integral for the said time. Because a lot of that only really got cut out within the past century or so, And they definitely had difference in a lot of stuff. And it definitely does change how you think of each one, because they do seem very different, but they have some very similar details that are very odd and are easy to miss, admittedly. And by 1200, which that number does seem to come up quite a bit, because it is a very important one. It's kind of where every civilization really begins to kick off. You have Japan, Korea, all of Southeast Asia, East and West Africa, Russia, which was becoming a new state, Western Europe, Aztec and Incas in the Americas, and, all these other areas really differed greatly. China, a huge East Asian civilization, had a big impact on Korea, Japan, Vietnam, especially since Korea and Vietnam did become a vassal state for quite a minute, where Islam began in, Arabia, and really moved to Middle East, some of Africa, Asia. All of this was very close together, especially in Asia and Europe, where a lot of the civilizations were developing, and some people argue that some of these were definitely a higher form than civilization, but the defining of that word is so strange, that a lot of these weren't villages, but they weren't like full-blown cities. So, everything had its own contrast. A lot of things had similarities, a lot of things had differences. Everything was very different, yet being so close.
The Mongol Empire. These guys were the ultimate disruptors. Unlike the settled civilizations they conquered, the Mongols built power through mobility and merit. Genghis Khan didn't care about your family tree. He cared if you could shoot a bow from a galloping horse. They ran their empire with a terrifyingly efficient military machine, but they maintained it through something called the Pax Mongolica. They essentially turned the Silk Roads into a giant high-speed highway. They provided security for merchants, which meant trade boon. The takeaway? They didn't just conquer, they facilitated. By taxing the massive flow of the goods across Eurasia, they kept the lights on in the capital, Karakorum. Now, let's fly south across the Sahara to the Mali Empire. If the Mongols were about movement, Mali was about monopoly. Think about Mansa Musa. This guy was arguably the richest person in history. How? Mali sat right on top of the world's biggest gold mines. They built their power by controlling the sand roads. They didn't just have gold, they had a monopoly on it, along with salt. Mali maintained power through religion and prestige. By adopting Islam, Mansa Musa connected Mali to the wider, sophisticated Islamic world. This famous pilgrimage to Mecca wasn't just a religious trip. It was a massive PR campaign that put Mali on every map in Europe and the Middle East. So, what do a nomadic horse lord and a West African king have in common? It's probably more than you think. First, it's trade. Both states realized that you can't have any power without money. Whether it was taxing Silk Road silk or Saharan salt, both empires functioned as gatekeepers of global trade. Cultural synthesis. Both were surprisingly tolerant. The Mongols employed Persian and Chinese bureaucrats. The Mali kings blended Islam with local West African traditions to keep their diverse subjects happy. And infrastructure. Both invested in the tech of their day. For the Mongols, it was the Yam Postal Service. For Mali, it was turning Timbuktu into a world-class center of learning. But let's look at the friction points. The differences are where it gets interesting. The Mongols were extractive. They moved into a region, smashing the existing government and replaced it with their own tax collectors. They were a state on the move. In contrast, look at the Ming Dynasty or the Inca Empire mentioned in our text. The Inca built their power through a massive state-run bureaucracy and the Mita system, forced labor for the public good. There was no private trade there. The state was the economy. Meanwhile, the Ming Dynasty in China reestablished power by looking backward, reviving ancient Confucian exams to ensure only the most loyal, educated elites ran the government. While the Mongols relied on raw military terror and trade flow, the Chinese and Incas relied on deep-rooted institutional control. At the end of the day, whether you're building 20,000 miles of stone roads in the Andes or sending Zheng He's massive treasure ships across the Indian Ocean, the goal was the same: connection. The states that survived weren't just the biggest swords. They were the ones that could plug themselves into the global network of ideas, goods, and gold.